Welcome back. We're starting a new organ system, the respiratory system. And we're going to start off with generalities about the respiratory system and then move into what's called the upper respiratory tract. So, the whole point of the respiratory system is ventilation, which is just the correct term for breathing. And when you're breathing, there's two parts of breathing. There's inhalation, also known as inspiration, and exhalation, also known as expiration. I tend to use the terms inhalation, exhalation, because otherwise expiration kind of sounds like you're going to die. You have an expiration date. All right. Now, I want you to realize that breathing is not the same thing as gas exchange. Gas exchange occurs after ventilation. And gas exchange, yes, is needed for cellular respiration, but first we have to do the inhaling and the exhaling before we're going to do the gas exchange. So let's talk about those divisions of the respiratory tract. Anatomically, we divide it into an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. Okay. And as we go through the pathway, I will have names of structures, and I'll tell you this is upper, 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 and then I will tell you when we are switching to the lower respiratory tract. And here's the difference. In the upper respiratory tract, we expect to find pathogens. Okay, we know there's critters in your nose because we breathe in through our nose, but we know there's critters in your nose. And we expect to find pathogens in your upper respiratory tract. But your lower respiratory tract, we expect it to be sterile. So when we find bacteria down there, that's not a good thing. But there's another way to look at the respiratory tract, and that is functionally. A lot of the respiratory tract is just conducting air. In other words, just moving it from place A to place B and not doing anything with that air. Just think of the air traveling on the 405 highway, inside a car, not doing anything. Whereas only a small part of the respiratory tract is actually going to be involved in the gas exchange. And so until I mention those words, gas exchange, we are in that functional part that's just conducting air from point A to point B. So let's get started with the upper respiratory tract. As I said, we breathe in through our nose, specifically what's called a nasal cavity. And a lot happens in our nasal cavity. We're filtering the air, we're warming the air, we're adding moisture to the air. Super important, especially this weekend when we have a Santa Ana here in Southern California with humidities in the teens. So if we look at the nasal cavity, you will see it's got these indentations in it. That's because we have these bones and cartilage in our nasal cavity. We have hairs in our nasal cavity. We know that because, got to pick those hairs in some gentlemen. The epithelium in our nasal cavity has cilia. So if you recall what cilia do, they move back and forth to move particles across the top. So they're moving particles in the mucus. This is a very tortuous pathway, so it gives lots of time to warm the air and add moisture to the air because there's a rich blood supply. So we're going to be adding a lot of moisture. In addition, we've got bones that have these spaces in them, like our maxilla and our frontal bone, and then two of our other skull bones, and they have openings from these spaces in the bone into our nasal cavities. So these spaces are called sinuses. So they're next to our nasal cavities, so they're called paranasal sinuses. And so the air that goes into our nasal cavity goes into those sinuses as well. Something else, if you thought about, you would realize, oh yeah, that's true. And that is there is a duct that drains tears from the surface of your eye into your nasal cavity. It's called the nasolacrimal duct. And you know this because when you cry, you always have to blow your nose, and that's because your tears are draining into your nasal cavity. And the last thing is we have an opening to our eustachian tube. So our eustachian tube goes between the back part of our nasal cavity to our middle ear. And that's how we can have the same pressure between our middle ear and these outside atmosphere. All right. From our nasal cavity, we are then going to travel into the pharynx, and pharynx is that part of your body that you have called your throat. And in fact, there's 3 different areas to the throat. There's the part that's behind the nasal cavity called the nasal pharynx, the part that's behind your oral cavity or your mouth that's called the oropharynx, and the part that's behind your voice box called the laryngeal pharynx. So the air is going to travel posteriorly behind all 3 of those structures and go back down your throat. But you know what else travels through part of your throat? Is food. So food's going to enter your oral cavity and go through the oral pharynx and the laryngeal pharynx. But here's what's going to happen. The air is traveling posterior and the food is traveling anterior to that. But if we look, what happens down here is the windpipe is anterior and their food tube is posterior. So what has to happen is the passages have to cross. Between the oropharynx and the laryngeal pharynx, we have to have a crossing of pathways so that the air ends up anterior, ends up posterior. So it's very interesting what is happening in your throat. And if that doesn't happen, then you'll have food down your airways going into your lungs, and that's not a good thing. All right. Continuing down the air pathway, assuming everything goes well, we're going to go into your larynx or your voice box. And here we have this whole framework of cartilages, all of which are going to be hyaline cartilages. And these are between your throat and your trachea, which is your windpipe. Okay. And so so if we look at them, these right here, this is your cartilage. So this is like your Adam's apple. If you're a gentleman, it's quite prominent. But I want to draw your attention to this cartilage right here. It looks kind of like a wooden spoon. This is called your epiglottis, and it is elastic cartilage, which means it can bend. And what this is going to do is it is going to bend down and cover the opening to your windpipe every single time you swallow. So go ahead and swallow, and it's covered it. And swallow again, and it's covered it. So here's a little GIF which shows as you're swallowing some food, here's the epiglottis. You see how it's covering the opening? So food will not be going down that trachea, but instead will be going down the esophagus where it belongs. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about in the larynx, besides these cartilage, we have the vocal folds, what you have called vocal cords your entire life. And when air rushes past them, this is what allows you to vocalize, produce sound, talking like I am doing. All right, continuing on with this pathway, we would no longer be in the upper respiratory tract. The vocal cords are the dividing line between the upper and lower respiratory tract. So I'll see you soon when we return to talk about the lower respiratory tract. See you soon.